Welcome back to We Know Scripted TV, where today we know The Last of Us Season 2, Episode 3. Hello, everybody. Mike Bloom, I'm back. A certain character isn't. So we're going to talk about the loss that was felt there, the next steps that are taken, both quite literally in the journey of Ellie and Dina, as well as everything going on in a community in mourning. But of course, it is a beautiful morning when I get to talk with this person, someone who I would gladly travel alongside to all ends of the earth and coast to coast as well. It is Grace Leeder. Grace, how are you?
Good morning, or I guess bad morning. We're just morning. Welcome back, Mike. You're here. Joel is no longer with us, but you're back. So yeah, happy to chat about season 2, episode 3 with you.
Yeah, so obviously a major shift in the state of affairs in
Mm-hmm.
multiple ways. Obviously, we have sort of the macro and micro destructions of the world as we knew it on The Last of Us, and both the invasion of Jackson, maybe is how I would refer to it, as well as,
Mm-hmm.
of course, Joel's absolutely brutal death. And so the follow up from it is always going to be an incredibly tough act to follow. And so we are going to get into exactly what that act is. You know, when it comes to, we're going to have yet another time jump here of a few months to allow Ellie to heal from her, at least her physical wounds, perhaps not her emotional ones. We're going to see exactly where we're moving forward next, both from a location perspective as well as from a plot perspective. So, Grace, when it comes to where things were going next, did this episode meet up to those expectations? Namely, from a pace perspective. I'm going to talk a lot about pace in
Mm.
this episode, both in my thoughts about last week as well as this week. Let's just open with the big one. Did you expect us to already be in Seattle with Joel's body, barely cold, even though it was very cold at the time that he died?
Well, I think in terms of like where the present day or like the main story, like where it goes, I feel like this is pretty accurate to like how quickly you sort of start to you don't linger in Jackson a whole lot. You end up Abby ends up Ellie ends up wanting to
How
go to
dare you?
Seattle, and yeah, I know,
Don't you
mixing up
say
the
that name.
I know. So that didn't surprise me. I did wonder whether or not we were going to. There's been this rumors of an episode much like season 1, episode 3,
Long
where it
time,
is
yeah.
sort of a diversion from the main story, and the rumor was it's a Eugene focused episode who is Gail's husband, and so I wondered whether we would get it sort of immediately. I actually think I think I was just putting episode 3 and then copy pasting to the new
Yeah,
season.
every episode 3 of The Last of Us is this off the trail portion of
Yeah.
time.
So I think it actually makes a lot of sense why we didn't do that, and I think that like it's stronger to sit with Ellie in this moment, like the moment. I said this last week with both Amon and with Taran, which is that what I really think is like so bold about the story of season 2 and of The Last of Us Part 2 is that you know what you expect basically from season 1, which is this Ellie and Joel story of the two of them traveling across the country together, and you sort of come back thinking like, well, I'm probably going to get something really similar to that, and they very quickly say, no, that's not the story, this is the story. And that moment is really marked by Joel's death, and so I think it's really important not to probably dive into like a Joel sort of specific flashbacky episode, and instead have us linger. I did say as soon as I finished watching the episode, I do feel like this is going to be one that I think you and I are like recording this before we'll have seen the reactions of the people. I think people are going to say this was boring, and there's been a little bit of this throughout with a couple of shows that have aired recently. I
Yeah,
feel like
it's instant gratification, right? Following this big
yes,
climactic moment, it's like, all right,
yes.
what's the chaser? What are we doing next? When it's more so, after you take that shot, kind of like slowly sipping your beer
I think
instead.
Severance and White Lotus both had this feeling of like as shows that were releasing week to week, and sometimes like we're not the most action packed episode or doing something different, and people feeling like what are we doing? What are we doing? But this is an important episode. I maybe more agree like more than I'm really trying to like fight the urge to say that like not enough happened for me. But for the most part, I think when we dive into scenes and moments of this episode, like the Gale stuff, I think in particular is like really, really, her sitting in the outfield of a little league baseball game is like,
Listen, Grace,
no
you're a
notes.
baseball fan.
Yes.
Who the hell's singing? Like, you must really is going nowhere. If you're like, you're not gonna hit the ball out here, it's
The
fine.
confidence of these children are shot of
Though we
like,
also know that, listen, Gail may not have the most like lofty prospects for her own livelihood. Maybe she's like, if I go full Simon Birch and I get hit in the head with a a Wayfair baseball, so be it. Let me go
yeah.
out the way I want to go out here.
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot that we can dive into that is really good. Like in terms of just what was actually on screen was really good. Of course, it has to live in sort of the shadow of a ginormous episode from last week. So we'll chat about it.
Yeah, so listen, I don't think people really care what I thought about last week. I think we moved on. People have said their piece, and I largely agree with what a lot of people are saying. Of course, I'll sort of cop a lot of similar comments about how I thought it really was masterfully done, sort of like a magic trick in a way of really distracting us with a little bit more of the action set pieces of the destruction of Jackson,
Yep.
alongside even like that really intense Abby in the mine with the fence moment to believe like, okay, that was our pulse pounding climax of the episode, only for her to look at a bag of golf clubs and realize that we have not teed off quite yet when it comes to climacticism. I thought the moment itself, I thought the episode itself was just so deliciously brutal. And I use an adjective before that I really ascribe to a lot of stuff I've seen in season 2 so far, which is bold.
Yeah.
Which is, to your point, I think, and without saying too much, of course, you and I are covering Andor alongside, our other person on this podcast series with The Last of Us, Taran Armstrong.
Mhm.
And without saying too much about this coming week's episodes of Andor, it's a very similar conversation we had where it's like, okay, season 1, we expected this very specific type of format, right? To your point, it's like, okay, we're on a journey. We're spending 2 to 3 episodes in a place at a
Yep.
time, but we're exploring the country alongside these two complicated characters. And so you assume when you get a sequel season that you're going to sort of get more of the same. To your point, that is not what the game was. That was not what this show is. I will also say right off the top here, because it might inform a couple things I say on this podcast. So I am not nearly as knowledgeable about The Last of Us Part 2 as I was about Part 1. I, of course, knew that Abby had killed Joel, and I knew a lot of people were mad about it. But to be candid, Grace, I remember basically nothing
Mhm.
outside of that. So any suppositions, any stands I make are purely coming from like a show only perspective. So that being said, once we knew we were eventually getting to this moment, I was greatly surprised that it happened in episode 2. Even when Mark
Mm.
Mylod's name showed up, I'm like, well, this will just be a fun little romp that he gets to do, not realizing that essentially his calling card are surprisingly dead
Mhm.
dads.
Mhm.
So R.I.P. He should direct like a Father's Day movie, just to like really
Yeah.
put a punctuation mark at the end of that sentence. But I was greatly surprised because I'm still living in, from a pacing perspective again, whether this choice is going to pay off. And it's interesting because you're going to talk about, you sort of lodge the straw man argument, assumingly, of like, this episode is slow, nothing happens. But I think this served as sort of a necessary way to move a lot of people along, both emotionally and physically. That does make me wonder, like, by the end of this season, do we feel like that was an endpoint that we had to get to? Again, a reason why I had assumed that Joel's death would be reserved for later on in the season is because we know there is at least a third season of The
Mhm.
Last of Us. And listen, if you're trying to, get to cash in on what brings people to HBO in the first place with this type of show, it's like, let's get as much Pedro Pascal as possible, knowing that he has an end date, which again makes what happened in last week's episode so incredibly bold. But all that is to say, to your point, I do think when you look underneath the surface, when you crack open that pipe and that foundation, there is life there, much like we saw last week as the harbinger of what was to come in Jackson. That I think there were a lot of necessary steps that were taken, both in getting Ellie and Dina out of Jackson and
Mhm.
to Seattle, but I think also in having these characters kind of check in with. It's really interesting, Grace, because one of the fundamental themes of The Last of Us, down to what Joel did in all caps at the end of season 1, is this idea of balancing the community need and the
Mm.
individual need. And we see that here where the episode begins with one of the many heartbreaking moments of this episode, which is like Tommy tending to the body of his dead brother and, trying to wash the vast amounts of blood off of him. And the camera widens to show that this is essentially the morgue of
Mhm.
Jackson. And it is this
Mhm.
firm reminder that will then get affirmed in the council meeting that, like, yes, Joel was a pillar to the community. Yes, they threw reams of flowers outside of their house. He was very beloved, but he was not the only person that died.
Yes. Yeah, and so we end up this episode with this sort of like pitch to the council, which we see that Jesse has joined, and there's going to be this vote on whether or not the Jackson will send people to Seattle to avenge Joel and other, yeah, I guess just Joel, because the rest of the
Yeah,
people
again, the
died from.
WLF was very, very dead set to the point where, again, I would say one of my minor quibbles with last week was the whole
Mhm.
like, all right, Dina, here is 1 hour exactly of sedative so that you will look at our backpacks, but nothing else. But
Yeah,
the WLF had very clear plans: do not hurt anybody else except for
right.
Joel. So that's unfortunately why Ellie barely has a leg to stand on. And I'm not just talking about when Manny kicked the shit out of her last week.
Yeah. So what I like is, I mean, this has been a thing of with Joel that we get in the first episode as well, of him being part of this community, and then this debate that he has with Maria about like whether or not they're going to let more people in, and she sort of says like, you were an outsider at one point as well. That sort of culminates in this moment where he actually does help an outsider, and it costs him his life. And so, I mean, I think that like this being in Jackson to start the season, I mean, Jackson isn't just an amazing set piece in terms of how it looks, but it's also this representation of what society like can be,
Yeah.
of what people could have in this future. And Ellie tries to play by the rules of hoping that the council will vote in favor of going and sending, how many people? It sounds like a lot. 16?
16.
Yeah, 16 people to Seattle to, hunt down Abby, and they say no. They vote no. That ultimately leads uh, Ellie and Dina to sneak out at night with the help of Steve. Um,
Seth.
Seth. See, who
You
cares?
just got Minecraft on the brain, Grace. So
Yeah,
that guy
that's
is a
right.
crafter as well. He's like, listen, I made you a
Yeah,
better rifle.
that's right. So I like that theme of in terms of trying to play within the bounds of this new society, playing along with everybody, and then ultimately not working. And Ellie says, I mean, I really like the parallels between Ellie and Joel in terms of how much, so much of their conflict was about the fact that Joel lied to her.
Mhm.
And um she says like, hey, I will abide by whatever decision this council makes. And
Yeah.
then
Hey, if
surprise.
listen, if
Yep.
if you or someone you love gets hurt, I'm there for you, babe. Don't worry. I'll be making cookies. Like, it's really, really fun because, to your point, that's not Ellie. And like, I
No.
give her all the credit. I definitely thought she would go full Ellie, and maybe the Ellie in episode 1 would have done this of like, screw you, man. I'm not writing a speech. She would have done like the best man thing where she like opens a piece of paper and then rips it up. Like, no, let me speak from the heart here. But like, she took Jesse's advice. She decided to write out more of a logical argument of basically saying like, this is not about one person's revenge. Joel was one of our own. Seth is going to make kind of a different side of the same
I think you
coin
mean
type argument.
Steve.
Yeah, sorry. So Steve, Steve is his like formal presence.
That's
When
right.
he's in the
That's right.
town council. But this argument of essentially being like, what do we stand for
Mhm.
if we are essentially allowing these people to quite literally get away with murder? But again, it ends up falling on deaf ears for the vast majority of the crowd because they have to sort of tend to their own first. And I think also it's incredibly intriguing to think about this. It's going to be odd, Grace, but almost like from a political perspective as well, where first off, I had a nice hearty chuckle when Jesse's like, people don't vote for anger. I'm like, oh, well, maybe this is like the one finger on the pulse
Mm.
that Truckman and Mason do not necessarily have on people as a whole. But I think it is this idea that at the end of the day, as much as people might have empathy and sympathy for those that are suffering around them, we are kind of selfish beings inherently. We saw that again with someone like Joel, who sacrifices a lot to keep someone that means a lot to him in his life and pays for it mightily with his own. But this idea of like, okay, I feel terrible for you, Ellie, and I love Joel too. This is what this one woman kind of espouses, right? But at the same time, these people are way too important to us. We need to rebuild ourselves as a community. That I wouldn't necessarily say that it comes across like the Jackson Council is like sweeping this under the rug and being like, well, let bygones be bygones. Let's move on. I think it's more so them having to find a way to sort of compartmentalize their own grief. And I think for a lot of people, that's done quite literally through constructive purposes, is to be like, okay, we are living in something that absolutely massacred so many important people in this community and made us feel unsafe. I will not spoil Battlestar Galactica because I know very little, but
Mhm.
there is one particular storyline that happens around the midpoint of Battlestar Galactica where you think that finally our main characters have settled into some sort of status quo, only to realize you can never really go back to before. And I think that was a firm reminder that the people of Jackson face. And that's a really tough reality to swallow. And so I think it totally makes sense on their part, as unsavory as it might be for Ellie and some of our main characters like Tommy and Jesse and Maria, to be like, God, I really liked Joel. At the same time, I would love to feel protected again. And sending 16 of our best people out while we are quite literally the walking wounded at this point ain't a great look.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how anybody. I mean, I imagine the 3 votes from the council. I mean, we don't know,
Yeah,
and I
we
wonder.
don't see the final words. We don't know who voted for whom.
Yeah, we don't learn. Tommy definitely should have played his hidden immunity idol to cancel out all the no votes. I would say no, does not count.
Yeah, you could say Jesse lost his vote on a journey when he went to that
Uh-huh.
7-Eleven.
I think you're supposed to presume that the 3 yes votes are Maria, Tommy, and Jesse, I think, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's 100% the case. And I don't think
And
we're
that and
gonna
that could
really
be an
explore it.
interesting point of division moving forward. Because I don't know. I'll give a hot take here, Grace, because I don't believe. Correct me if I'm wrong here. I don't know if the game moves on from Jackson. I do not think we're moving on from Jackson. I think specifically Gabriel Luna and Young Mazzino being in the main credits indicates to me that we are going to be spending time in Jackson still and probably dividing our focus between there and Seattle.
Yeah, I think Taran and I can get more into it because I feel like it leans into spoiler territory, but there is a little bit of like reshuffling of events in terms of
Okay.
like some stuff that I think tracks with what you're saying. So yes. But yeah, I mean I think that I think it's totally right not to vote against this proposal of like not to send 16 people to go to Seattle from Wyoming to hope to try and find Abby, not even really knowing what you might be up against. It makes total sense that they don't vote for it. But I do like this the way in which Ellie sort of tries to hope that these people will give them what they're
Right.
looking for. Yeah.
It's interesting that she couches it saying, "This is not vengeance, this is justice." And
Right.
again, it's very nuanced choices of language, right? Because vengeance is so coded to like eye for an eye. No, no, no. Something wrong happened to us. And we are going to the only way to do it is to like exact our own way of making that wrong right. But famously, two wrongs don't make a right. And that's what I love as well about the choice that Abby made is that grief. Follow this with me, Grace.
Mm-hmm.
This is a bit of a
Yes.
labored analogy
Yes.
here, but grief is almost like digging a hole out of your heart, out of your soul, out of your
Mm.
emotional well-being. And I think for a lot of people, Abby included, Ellie at this moment, they feel like by getting vengeance, you're just filling the hole back up with dirt again. You're like, great, this should paper over everything, and I'll at least go to bed happy that while I don't have this person in my life, they were avenged. More in actuality, it's kind of like filling the hole with water,
Mm.
where it's like you might think that this is no longer just an empty, air filled space in the ground. But the fact of the matter is, over time, that water is going to evaporate. That water is going to, I don't know, maybe get drunk by any sort of passing animals or humans. And due to erosion circumstances, you end up with an even deeper hole than
Mm.
you did earlier. And so I think that is one of the massive lessons that I think, again, we don't see a lot of Abby in this episode, but I would imagine 3 months later, she's not completely right as rain, oh happy day, skipping down the lane in Seattle singing songs at the top of her lungs. It's this insatiable taste where I would imagine while she felt incredibly good in that moment and satisfied for what she spent, 5 years planning for, what happens after that?
Yeah, can I give you I'm going to give you my favorite like metaphor about grief actually, which
Yes,
is
do it.
the thing that I always heard was imagine when someone passes away, you have like a box. If I say just like a box, and inside of it is a ball, and that ball represents grief, and that
Mm,
ball is bouncing around. And when you're in the immediate aftermath of having someone pass away, the grief is the ball is humongous, and every time it hits the side of the box, that's a moment that you have where you are sort of like you remember that person, or
mm.
you have this moment. And so Ellie having like going to his house is like the ball is humongous, and she's seeing all of these different things. This very sad moment when she goes there to take she grabs the gun, but she also like stops
Ellie's
and
got
sees his.
a gun.
That's right. And she also stops to see his shirts, right? The ball in the box is humongous. And I feel like and the hope is that the more you go along, the ball gets smaller, and the ball never disappears. You always will have these moments where the ball will hit the side of the box, and you experience grief from having lost, even if it's 10 years later, you have these moments of remembering that person.
Yeah.
I think the problem with revenge is that you keep that ball humongous because it's
Yeah.
your sole focus. It's going to hit the side of that box over and over and over again because it's huge. And I feel like that's the situation that Ellie has sort of put herself in. I talked last week about this like trauma passing that the
Mm.
show has done, where like Joel basically passes trauma on to Abby, and then Abby has now passed it on to Ellie. That I think is a really strong resonant theme. But yeah, I mean, we don't. I think it's also a very interesting choice that we didn't revisit Abby this episode after doing a lot of work to like. She's the first and last shot of the first episode, and but we don't revisit her. But yeah, this is what now Ellie's sort of consumed with, and it will be consumed with over the course of this season.
Let's rewind a bit to Ellie's, I wouldn't say immediate aftermath, because again, as we see, her immediate aftermath is like her waking up in the hospital screaming, still seeing visions of that horror. But like,
Super
where's
interesting for her to be in a hospital, like
exactly, like
the
talk about
parallel to the end of last
PTSD
season.
in
Yeah,
multiple ways.
yeah,
But what we see of her 3 months later, which is the fact that she still can't get rid of that sense of humor. Of course, when she sits down with Gail, and Gail's essentially doing like, I wouldn't say an exit interview, but like one final psych check, essentially, to be like, okay, are you right as rain
love
to
this.
get out of there?
Yeah,
She essentially regurgitates back all of this formulaic, therapy speak of like, I wish I could have let him off the hook for whatever it was he was talking about. I guess I'll have to let myself off the hook for that. Just kind of like going through the motions. She's completely stone faced walking out of the hospital, just kind of like in a trance, seeing all of the now sort of decayed flowers around them. And I will admit, Grace, maybe I was just in so much captivation from how they pulled off the moment last week that like I don't know how much emotionality I felt around Joel's death. I got freaking hit by a Mack truck
mm,
with the scene with her at the closet because, I mean, for many reasons, I would project that this is like the first time. First off, remember that like if she's been in a hospital for 3 months, she's kind of been in like a semi-public setting this entire
yep,
time.
yep.
Where she feels like she can't really be herself. She's sneaking push-ups and sit-ups when the doctors aren't looking because she feels like she can't really be herself. So this is like the first time she is really truly alone too, which is of course the great irony because a lot of the attitude she had in episode 1 was like, leave me alone, like don't be with me, Joel. And so now that she is sitting here in this moment, her with the shirt, the jacket, just God, it got me really, really good because it's this, I don't know, the way Bella Ramsey played it was like almost like her embracing her dad for the last time, which
Yeah.
like, whew,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean that's even got me going right now. Like this way of, and she'll have, I think, more of a moment of, I would say, closure later on. But to your point, the box never gets kind of closed at the end of the day. Like she can't really be like, all right, Joel, part of my life is over, moving on. As Gail says, they've been walking side by side throughout, they'll keep walking side by side here. But just having that one singular moment alone with Ellie tells me so much. And I think the big question mark coming out of episode 2 is like, how is this show going to function now as like almost a Bella Ramsey solo joint? And I think that performance and that moment alone shows me that we're in good hands.
Yeah, I mean it. I mean, the thing that's it's just tragic about it is that like there was a lot of debate, Mike. I don't know if you because like the last time we talked about The Last of Us was we had recorded our episode 1 recap, and then the episode went off into the world and people reacted to it, and there was a lot of debate about, was Ellie being a brat? I feel like nobody's on
Was she
my
having a
side.
brat summer?
Yeah, nobody was on my side that Joel was actually more in the wrong. I think everyone was like, no, Ellie's being an annoying teenager, even though she's 19. You know, she's being ungrateful. More, I feel like people put more blame on Ellie than Joel, and I think that is fair, and maybe what the show more wants us to think than the alternate version, because the tragic thing is that if really, if we sort of like, not that it needs to be broken down into like one of them was wrong and one of them was right, but if you're more on the side that Ellie was in the wrong, this is a tragic story for Ellie in terms of the way that things were left between her and Joel, because while Joel is not delicate in terms of the way he comes in episode 1 and is like, here, I'm gonna fix your guitar, give me it.
Yeah.
And then leaves, you know. It's a really ham-fisted way of trying to like mend things,
It's a
but
sense of desperation, yeah.
100%. But people might argue that it's like it's Ellie who's not willing to give in these moments, and like Joel is at least coming in. You know, she's living in Joel's how, I don't know what property ownership looks like in Jackson, like how, you know, but she is living in the
Eminent
garage.
domain was the main thing the council wanted to get across in their
Yeah,
musings.
yeah. All the young kids are like, we're never going to be able to afford it.
We just have to wait for the old generation to get killed off by the infected.
And so yeah, I mean, and like, so it's this heartbreaking thing that she it's like, in a sense, she never chose to try to mend things with Joel, and ultimately he dies. And so this going into the house, and you know, it is like, there is like the thing of like her actually choosing to go back, like, and it's sad because it's now it's empty. Like, she could have
Yes.
gone and done this before, when he was alive, but she didn't. And the other thing too, like in terms of all of that piece too, there's this thing in episode 1 where she wants to go do patrol with Joel, but he left early, knowing that she probably wouldn't have wanted to go on patrol with him, and then he dies, right? Whereas if they're together, doesn't mean she saves him, but you know, whatever, you know, things would have happened differently. And so yeah, this moment of her going through the house is quite sad. I think it's interesting because she goes into the, I think it feels like she goes more into like the office than anything, and it's almost like she then like gets caught. She like stops herself as she sees like his bedroom and and like the clothes hanging, and then it's like, oh man, okay, and then she heads over there. But yeah, it's really beautiful. It's really sad.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
it's a reminder that at the end of the day, as obstinate and stubborn and independent as you might be, like, she needed him,
yeah,
you know? And we see that in the end as like she's crying out to him, obviously, with all the horrors that happened at the end of last episode. But again, the fact that she embraces even like one of the last visages of him in the form of this shirt, this jacket, almost like clinging to his arm in the way that a child might to their parent when they're scared. Oh god, every time I talk about it,
well,
it really has me going.
and there's this thing, I think, like, it's a tough thing to get across in television, but like scent and people is a thing that like is
Yeah,
like,
they really should have done smell-o-vision for
they
this show. I
should.
agree, Grace.
Last week's would have sucked, but this
Oh
week's would
my
have been
god, it would have like, imagine having a watch party and just the living room reeks of all get out.
infected and decomposing bodies.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is that thing of like, as she's like embracing the shirt, you know. Yeah, it's yeah.
I want to talk about Gail's perspective
Yes.
here in a couple of different ways. Let's go back to the conversation that she has with Ellie, where again, Ellie is going to say what assumingly she thinks Gail wants her to say, right? She's trying to pass a test right now, which is when she talks about the New Year's Eve argument, that this was the last time that they spoke. I guess first off, Grace, let me ask, because in last week's episode, Ellie does this whole entire thing to Jesse, right? The spiel of like, nope, everyone thought that we're bad. We're good. Don't worry about Joel. Don't worry about me.
Yeah.
Do you think it's implied that the two of them did have a conversation that we haven't seen yet between that New Year's Eve scuffle and Joel going out with Dina the next day? And that's sort of what she's implying here as well.
Um, Tough one because let's just say let's say Taran and I will talk more. I
There
don't
we
know how
go.
to say. I feel like that's a big spoiler. But
All right,
you know,
well, we'll see. Well, a little tease for tomorrow's podcast. But all that is to say, as she's talking about, at least from Gail's perspective, that's the last time that they spoke. Ellie is going to say, your final moment with someone doesn't define your whole time with them. And Gail, in all of her fantastic bedside manner, says, it shouldn't, but oftentimes it does. And I think that's just such a deliciously complicated sentiment, right? It's not just Gail trying to slap down Ellie's hand and being like, no, don't be positive about this. Remember that time that you left things on horrible terms? You could never apologize to him while he's still living. I think it more so speaks to this idea that when it comes to the people that we lose in our lives, sometimes we do get those kind of like nice storybook moments. I mean, Rob Cesternino has told many a time the story of the last call that he had with his father, where he just like sort of felt that urge to pick up the phone and talk to him, not knowing that it would be the final conversation that they had. Unfortunately, that is usually the exception to the rule. This is a bit apples and oranges, Grace, but I think back to like How I Met Your Mother, right? When
I was just thinking that.
yeah, when Marshall's dad ends
Yeah.
up passing away, right? And he's like, oh my God, this is the last thing that I get to hear. And it's a butt dial. And like,
Yeah.
this is the last thing that I have to remember my dad by. I think, again, as humans, we try to get this sense of like almost scripting ourselves into a story, into a narrative of like, okay, this is how our relationship concludes. When in actuality, sometimes the sentence just gets left without a punctuation mark at the end of it. But that does not necessarily, I don't know, overwrite the words to end the sentence as well, which is kind of what Gail is alluding to. That, like, yes, the fact that Ellie does not necessarily, from our perspective, get the opportunity to make up with Joel, that doesn't mean like she should live with regret for the rest of her life. At the same time, I think what Gail is saying is like, this is maybe a bit of a canary in the coal mine for like some larger unresolved tension you had with him that doesn't necessarily get erased with the fact that he's not here anymore.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I think is so tragic about these stories that deal with death, and I think the stories that we're sort of pulling from are a lot of these like these fatherly figures in the way that moments get left with the fathers. I think the thing that I mean, I go, this feels the most like I think like end of season one Game of Thrones, than
Mm.
anything, because it feels like, when you're watching Game of Thrones season one, you kind of expect that Ned Stark is going to be the person you're going to follow the whole time. And even though we did get a full season of Joe, like technically it's like probably about the same amount of episodes before, if you look back on
I
season
mean,
one of
yeah,
Game
we
of
got
Thrones.
what, 11 of Joel, we got 9 of Ned Stark, so
Yeah.
pretty comparable.
Yeah, pretty comparable there in terms of like who you think you're sort of like following, other than that you get this like season one arc. But yeah, it is this thing of like the way, you don't know when death is coming for someone, and the way in which like these the endings are not these storybook endings. I think this is what I really think that what Game of Thrones did with that moment was that it felt like, oh, if there was this more realism to it, like even though it is a
Mm.
story, it did feel like, oh, like it feel like this is more how things happen, that sometimes the person you perceive to be the hero ends up dying. And I think this is the same thing here, where and so that's a really sort of awful thing, and then how does that sit with the other people who are in that person's life, which is in this case it's Ellie. I love this. I think Gail is such a tremendous add to this season. I mean,
Yeah.
Catherine O'Hara like playing the role is spectacular, but there is something very fun to this. Is such a character rich show. I think like this is
Yes.
a character first show more than anything else. And so the idea of then like adding a therapist into the mix is very fun.
Well,
Yeah.
not to mention that the therapist, it's very much as she talks about with Tommy, the who watches the Watchmen of like,
Right.
she's not the Dr. Melfi where she can't see somebody, right? She kind of
Right.
has this like overweening power where she can sort of cast judgments upon others and not really have an ability to offload onto anybody else but her patients. So
Yeah.
let's talk about the scene with Tommy a little bit. We've got what, Gangels in the outfield, maybe,
Yeah.
with the two of them
Mhm.
sitting and hanging out. I will also say this seen very much past the Bechdeli test, and that all they're doing is talking about Ellie. And Gale is going to continue a little bit of like her analysis of her, right? I mean, there's some really choice lines to pull out of this. First, with Tommy saying there's a difference between lying and being a liar, which again is a very fun distinction and choice of words. That maybe it's this idea of like the behaviors we take in versus the roles that we inhabit. You know, like everybody lies, but what's the difference between saying a lie and actually being labeled a liar, which is like a capital B bad thing? But let's talk about Gale, like pro nature versus nurture, which is again very interesting perspective to have as a therapist, right? Imagine you would take more so the pro nurture of like, let's talk about your childhood and why it made it who you are. From this perspective, she's actually more so saying like, if there's a path, it's not one Joel put her on. I think they were walking side by side from the very start. And this is something we talked about a little bit, Grace, especially when the Left Behind episode, where we got a little
Mhm.
bit more into Ellie pre Joel, which is, I think, one of the reasons why they found so much attraction to each other, is because, albeit in very different settings, they possess a lot of similar qualities and views on the world.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, the thing that is so compelling about the two of them is that they like anytime they butt heads, it's actually because they're so similar. I mean,
Exactly.
there is this thing, I think, like the fundamental difference between the two of them is that I think Ellie is sort of looking for she rebels against authority, but is looking for connection in a way that
Hmm.
Joel wasn't. Like that's the fundamental difference I think between them in terms of the dynamic in season one, is that Joel knows what it's like to like open up and have your heart broken.
Yeah.
And I feel like what's really interesting is that I feel like this is the moment that this has like maybe is the moment that Ellie could become more like Joel than even she was before, where she's had her heart broken and now she's, in the way that Maria is trying to tell Joel, like, hey, like we need to take it out. We need to bring in more out. We need to let these people in. We need to like build the community. And you basically have this a very similar sort of conflict that Ellie has where she's like, I want to, you know, do this thing I will hope that the council votes for me to be able to go and do this thing, and I'm going to frame it as this like we're doing it as for justice. And when it doesn't work, she's actually like going to sort of go in, she's going to put the walls up and go do it herself, so
Mm.
I do feel like the moment that Joel dies is ironically this moment that there's at least the potential that Ellie can become more like Joel than she was before. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Another great Gale line from this exchange. Again, very surprising coming from a therapist of all people. Some people just can't be saved. And
Mm.
I don't know, Grace, maybe it's the Mark Mylod DNA that we had last week, but like it almost seems like Gale and Succession as a whole were kind of making the same point, right? And that was sort of the controversy behind Jesse Armstrong approach to that show, which is like people are not capable of changing, especially those that are in such privileged, lofty positions that no matter what they undergo, they still default back to their general sense of self because that's their sense of safety and what they're surrounded by. And so it's intriguing in a very different setting, but in a very similar network to have Gale kind of make a similar point, which is like, people will inevitably just go back to what they're most comfortable feeling, which again, I think does serve as, and this happens after the vote at the council, but I think speaks to even that perspective as well of like, listen, the idea, some people might just want to wallpaper over this idea that like they were attacked and that these other people randomly charged in and killed one of the most beloved community members. They would much rather, from their own compartmentalization perspective, like put that behind them and try to move on and bring Jackson back to where it needs to be. Similar for Ellie, it's this idea that she can get all the help that she wants to at the end of the day. If she doesn't want to save herself, then she's going to have to get herself most of the way there, you know?
Yeah, I mean that's really. I haven't thought about that in the way that, like, what is the philosophy on this show about whether or not people can change? Because I think if you look at season one, Joel has character growth, but I
Yes.
but I think almost if you look at the moment he has where like him and Tommy and Sarah, like the that moment when like the apocalypse happened, like when the first wave of infections happen, like it's not like his circle of like who he cares about and who he protects is like you know enormous. He's not like, like he's not saving everybody. He just
Right.
has let people into his circle, and that his daughter and his brother are people who are in his circle. And when we meet him sort of in the time jump, he then has oh, I feel really bad that I forget her. Is it Teresa? I'm trying to remember the name of the
Tess.
Tess. That's right. He has Tess in his circle. But like, again, it's not like this is a humongous thing. And I think it's just about these, like, he has this armor up and he is willing to let people in. But when we meet him by the point, like, especially when Tess dies, he really doesn't want to let Ellie in at all. And eventually, like, he cracks open a little bit. But what's interesting is that, like, Maria in episode 1 trying to get him to, like, crack open that armor again is I'm not saying that Maria killed Joel, but I am saying that doing the thing that he didn't really want to do, which is, like, protect someone, an outsider, is what leads him to go do that. And so there's this, like, world where actually, like, his sort of character ultimately leads him to do it. And so, in some ways, like, we talked about this last week, I think especially talked about it with Taran, where there's this great character choice of Joel has been steadfast in his refusal to admit that he had done what he did at the end of season 1.
Yeah.
And there's a moment with Abby where she confronts him and he nods. He doesn't really say like, yeah, I did. I killed your dad. Like, he doesn't say that, but he does nod in agreement,
Because this is the only other person that knew about it. And so this is the first time that, like, someone is actually speaking almost truth to power from his perspective and be like, I know what you did 5 years ago. You effed up my life. And he's like, okay, now this is finally, the truth shall reveal itself. It's finally coming to the forefront. I have no choice but to agree.
And, like, you never know what would happen, like, if he starts to, like, defend himself and be like, and lie and be like, no, I didn't do that, like, whatever. No, but once sort of, like, she knows that he, like, we're on the same page, this is what happened. Now I'm gonna kill you now. Like, that's Abby's, that's what's going to happen. I think that's, like, really interesting. And then in terms of, like, now trying to map that on to Ellie, will Ellie be somebody who sort of sees in that path of, like, if I sort of, and there's a really interesting thing of having Dina, where, like, Dina is, Ellie is so much closer to letting Dina in than Joel ever was to let Ellie, to let Ellie into his life. So it is different. They are at different stages of their life as well, that I think, like, lead them to be a little bit more open to this thing. But it'll be really interesting to see how, like, if we can sort of track that onto Ellie in terms of, like, this now being sort of her singular focus and what that means for her as a character moving forward.
Yeah, so let's talk about moving forward, because it does seem that Ellie is taking to the road again. I think one of the reasons why she did it is not only to sort of take on the Thanos, fine, I'll do it myself edict, but more so this idea of this is kind of her comfort zone, I would imagine, as uncomfortable as it might be, which is like, I'm traveling with this other person across the country. Like, maybe I'm not the type to necessarily settle down. And so, to your point, Grace, I'm really intrigued to see what role Dina is going to play, because from our perspective in the first episode, she was sort of like, I wouldn't say the surrogate daughter for Joel, but certainly someone that could fill that space that Ellie had left empty for Joel, of, like, someone I could talk to, someone that I could build this sort of bond with. Dina's going to say in this episode, like, I loved him too. And so we see a lot of her role from Joel's perspective. From Ellie's perspective, it obviously is a little more complicated. So could she fill the Joel role of being this companion, of being this person to rely on? You obviously have the romantic element linked into it. Grace, can I like throw a theory out?
Yes,
and you do not respond whatsoever.
Yes.
Exactly. Blank face.
Mm-hmm.
Because we get this moment in the tent with Dina and Ellie, where Dina, in the 3 months, like, God, it must be exhausting trying to, like, occupy the same space as Dina and Jesse, because, like, they break up, they're back together. Like, honestly, Joel's watch is broken. You could set the time by whether or not these two are romantically entangled or not.
That's right.
But she kind of just randomly, before they go to bed, which always happens, right? As soon as you get to bed, the random thoughts and anxieties you have about the day come flooding through your head. And so for her, it's this idea of, like, she points out that Jesse has been sad. And she wonders if it's just him or if there's something going on with them. What I would imagine, and again, I don't know essentially anything that happens after Joel's death, so this is just me speaking to the clouds, as it were, and we'll see if the clouds respond back. I think there's a reason why Dina left to go to Seattle that wasn't just about Ellie. Again, in a
Mm,
show that is all about how selfless maneuvers have a certain degree of selfishness to them.
yeah.
It's pointing one finger and four kind of pointing back at you. It could be the fact that she did not feel safe with him. Could be that maybe there's something being nursed inside of her that
Mm.
made her feel like it's something that she wanted to run away from, that she felt, oh, this is something that he doesn't want, and so let me leave. But I feel like we're gonna plant a flag in that. I don't know what's gonna happen next. It seems like they're just gonna like hunker down in Seattle maybe for the next little while, but I think we're gonna find out a little bit more as to Dina not necessarily leaving to help Ellie out of like 100% altruism.
Yeah, I mean, I like that in terms of this of it, if it's sticking with the themes of the show of that even there is there such thing as like altruism of like
Exactly.
things
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that everything sort of everyone has their own reasons to do something that is more than just like I just want to help so I think that
hmm
that's that is interesting. There is I think there's a line that she says specifically, um something about where Ellie says like, "Oh, and like you'll probably go back to Jesse," and then she says, "Oh, I already did." So yeah.
Yeah, and I think also, you know, to your earlier point about how we're haunted by our past, a nice little nod to the Left Behind stuff when Dina's trying to pass the time and be like, "Tell me about the first person you killed," and Ellie's like, "Oh,
Yeah.
give me yada yada, pass the first one for a second. I don't like to talk about my exes there," but I imagine that's going to, come to the forefront. Dina is going to affirm in this moment that like it was a bit of a tryst on New Year's Eve, that we'll see how unrequited that lasts. I do want to rewind a bit and also talk about Seth, Steve, whatever you want to say here, because
Mhm.
I don't know, it was a little bit of like the worst person just made a good point, right? And I think if I was Ellie, might be a bit of a red flag as to like, is what I'm pursuing actually on the right side of things? Because Seth is going to be one of the most staunch supporters of this. We have this other random guy, I think his name's like Carson or something, at the council trying to say, I'm no Christian, but can we turn the other cheek? Like, this is what separates us from the animals, is the fact that we can enact mercy. But like, Seth is kind of espousing beliefs that, to be candid, one might expect of a bigot that said, this is a family affair from two women kissing at New Year's Eve, when he essentially is like, they came into our house, they took one of ours. If somebody shoots your brother, you want to take the locks off the doors, they'll come back. They'll come back because we didn't make them pay. We got to bring down the iron fist. And so not only does this allow Ellie to find an incredibly unlikely ally to the point that he's going to help her and Dina escape Jackson at the end of the day, it does serve, though, back to a theme that you and I have talked about in time memoriam on this podcast, which is like the danger that can come with somebody you love, and the fact that the person whose philosophy Ellie vibes with the most is essentially the guy that's like, all right, we got to come down with them with fire and fury if they came into our backyard and are trying to, take our people.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I imagine that there'll be some conflict. I think in terms of like Seth being the character who sort of helps them a little bit. I mean, he says an awful thing in episode 1. It's not just like, hey, it's a family affair, but then he literally uses like a homophobic slur. He calls them dykes
Mhm.
in the barn. We do get the apology
Yeah, but it
last
was
episode.
very much, listen, as the parent of a 5-year-old, it's very much like, now say you're sorry.
Yeah,
Like, did he really mean it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. On one hand, like I get what Maria's trying to do. On the other hand, there's no way for an apology to feel like I feel like he's kind of in, and I don't mean to defend Seth, but like you're kind of in a no-win situation once you've been told you have to apologize, and like
Mhm.
so. Yeah, so now like any apology is going to have some sort of weight of like, well, did you ever really mean it because you were told to apologize? And so that's like, not that he's in the worst situation. He's, he did a bad thing. I don't mind it. I mean, one thing that I think is like really important to remember about the show is that we're kind of in like Arrested Development from 2003, not the television
I mean,
show.
quite literally, it was on in 2003.
Yeah. So in terms of like gay rights, like it's not like gay marriage got passed or what, you know, like we're
Maybe it
in a
did in
post.
Jackson. We don't know.
Maybe that's true. I mean, they probably would marry them. You probably could, but I just mean in terms of like, it's not like there's television representation of queer people or like anything like
Yeah.
that, right? So you have to imagine that there's a little bit of like, um, some sort of like stasis in terms of like the way, and in other ways, there's like this freedom that like Ellie kind of has always been openly, you know, openly gay, in terms of how she's lived her life because there weren't as many like reasons to not do that, you know? So it's like there's this like interesting thing. I don't mind like Seth being the one to like show up and be the one who actually ends up helping them
Yeah.
get out of
I think it
Jackson.
speaks to like I wouldn't even say growth from his character, but like a dimensionality. But I think it also again speaks to the theming of like this is the guy that agrees the most with Ellie. Ellie, maybe you should give a second thought about your revenge plot, considering that this is the guy that most staunchly agrees with what you are saying. And I will also say it ended up working out well that he mentions that he would have gone with her, but he ends up taking on some friendly fire during the
Yeah.
course of the attack on Jackson. And I think it makes a lot of sense because Ellie, it'd be so easy, right, to be like, who's the new Joel, right? Let's map onto all these older men that Ellie's going to come across as to who's going to be the new father figure in her life. When, like, that's not what the show needs, and that's especially not what the character needs. The character needs to live in a post-Joel world. It would feel a little regressive to then say, and here's another, grumpy, complicated older male for Ellie to worm her way into their heart.
Yeah, and it also is just like it, you know, I really, I mean, there's the handshake, I guess, but Ellie doesn't have to be, she doesn't really have to forgive him, you
No.
know? Like, she's also, you know, in the world where like the selfishness thing you're talking about in terms of like what you do, like she gets a new gun, and gets, you know, he opens the gate for her and closes it behind her, you know, like she gets something out of this guy who is like seeming clearly trying to do something. I think that there is this world where like I think right now like we want to like, you know, because he said that thing, we want to put him, uh you know, you know, if we canceled everybody who says something like homophobic, I'm sorry, but we also do have to cancel my own, you know, my own, some of my own family members, you know. So I don't know, I'm like I'm more for it in terms of like Seth being a part of the story, how I think it like fits thematically. But
Well,
yeah.
Seth has opened up the gates. Let's look outside the walls of Jackson here and talk about the danger. There are wolves outside, Grace, in the
Mm.
form of the Washington Liberation Front. And we potentially see the havoc that they can wreak even outside of Joel. So let's talk about these. I'm going to use the term cultists. I don't know who these people are, but the fact that, they all have some very distinct marks, much like the Joker. I want to find out how they got
Mhm.
these scars, but we can't really talk to them because we get this brief check in with them on the road. They are escaping from war, as they say, but this is a theme that comes about as recent as last episode. War is inescapable in this post apocalyptic environment. And we see as like everyone gets many, many more lethal scars on their body and get absolutely slaughtered by assumingly the WLF, though we don't know necessarily.
Yeah, we don't know that for sure. This group is, I'll just name, I don't think it's any reason to not name them. They're the Seraphites. It was
Seraphites,
sort of
okay. There was a lot. Their symbology was like a lot of seraph. So it reminded me a lot of the Heroes. Primatech paper had like this sort of helixy emblem to it.
Yeah, so I mean, they obviously, the whistling is important in there, you know, that they're sort of like blending in, hiding in the show using these whistling calls. It's so sad that the little kid has the like does she have the scars? I can't remember. No, she doesn't
She,
have
no,
them yet.
she does have the scars. They all have the
Yeah, she
scars.
doesn't. Oh, yeah. So yeah, so sad. But yeah, we'll learn more about them, but not these people. They are dead
Yeah,
in the forest.
though I did really find intriguing, the one conversation we get, which is a little exposition-y, but still, again, speaks to the themes of the show. And when it comes to, like, I mean, we've dealt with leadership in the past, right? I think in particular of Kathleen, which is Melanie Linsky's character from the whole Kansas City arc, which gets referenced in this episode. The idea of who do you follow? In a world in which humanity has essentially broken down, there are still social dynamics and hierarchies that get built out just based on who we are as people. Who do you follow and why do you follow them? And I thought the guy, the father, I suppose, of this girl, Constance, had said some really interesting things about this prophet who had died 10 years ago, that the Seraphites essentially follow the prophet's teachings. Despite the fact that she passed a decade ago, he says, a prophet isn't magic. They're just people that see truths hidden from others and share that truth no matter what the cost. And so it is this kind of like, even for a very mystical talk, right, about beliefs in uh sort of like non-tangible things, right, which is a lot of what religion and belief systems are about. It still is in true Last of Us style, like very rooted in realism, where this guy's saying like, yeah, listen, I'm not saying that this person's coming down and then, making miracles happen, but they are speaking truth to power that we don't necessarily have the foresight to see. And it is up to us to not only listen to those values, but also carry them on in our day to day.
Yeah, I mean, religion is kind of one of the things that we haven't explored a lot
Yeah.
in The Last of Us so far. So, this is, yeah, has some, it's definitely religion coded here. So, will be interesting to see how it plays. Because yeah, it's something we haven't seen very much of in The Last
Yeah.
of Us. No.
And listen, I'm sure we'll get into it, our own separate belief systems. But like, it's this idea of, as I keep going back to, like, selflessness versus selfishness, of like, well, I must do this, to follow the will of the prophet or the person I follow, when like a lot of actions can be self-serving as well. I think that belief systems are something that we can hang a lot of our actions upon to help us sleep at night and make us feel like we are working towards a greater purpose, even if, we are not necessarily doing the best things to get there. Is the juice worth the squeeze? And let's talk about the veritable produce aisle we have in Seattle here, because this entire time we're like, yeah, we only know 5 people from WLF. Eugene was saying they're a ramshackle organization. These people out west, they're smoking too much 7-Eleven ganja. They don't know how to get their shit together. And then we get this very menacing, like, final military parade, essentially, of this giant tank going down the street of Seattle, a whole realm of foot soldiers as well. That goes to show that these two are heading into a lot more danger than they might reckon.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's kind of fun that we get introduced by, like, we know that Abby and her crew are part of the WLF, but then to actually like see what that means, which is more than just a ragtag group, but an actual military force. And it certainly seems like the idea to vote against sending 16 people to Seattle might have been definitely the right vote to deny that, because seems like Ellie and Dina might be a tad overmatched by a literal military force walking through the streets of Seattle.
Though again, I don't know the video game, but like, this is typical video gamey stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I also love last week that Abby was essentially doing the kill count for Joel, of like, again, which was a very fun meta narrative of, I think with video games, there's certainly amount of desensitization of like,
Yes.
oh yeah, I'm just sort of gunning people down. They're the enemy. I don't really care about them, when they all have lives, they all have families. And so here, they'll be overwhelmed, but I think they can work their way in. I certainly hope so, because I will say, Grace, this Manny guy, he could be
Mm-hmm.
he could be wiped off the board immediately. This little asshole, like everyone else, I'm intrigued by, right? Owen seems to sort of be the cooler for Abby. There's that
Uh-huh.
one that the I think Mel, her name is, that was like visibly upset with what was happening. This guy Manny was like salivating
Yeah.
in all the stuff that Abby had to do. There's something wrong with this guy. He
He's
and
in
he
this.
was watching the wrong stations. Like, he could
Yeah.
GTFO as far as I can consider.
Seems like he's hanging out in the Space Needle, which I don't know about you might I don't think I'm going into any tall building in the apocalypse. Like, I just don't know that they've been like structurally checked in 20 years.
Plus,
I'm not going up.
I feel like that's a little too high of a vantage point. Like, you really
Yeah,
have to
that's
have
right.
good eyesight. I don't know if even
That's
if you look
right.
through binoculars, you're like, I see everything on the horizon. Just like maybe a smidge too high. I also love, though, as well, we saw this really for the first time in Salt Lake City last season. Here we get a little bit of, again, the fun dichotomy of like the urban jungle with quite literally jungle vibes to it, with all the overgrown elements and greenery to it. But then again, the staunch slap to the face of the militaristic
Yeah.
imagery of like the tank parading itself down the street. So that's where we're going to
Eh,
leave episode 3. Grace, anything else you want to say
Well,
about this week's state of affairs?
just the last scene. I think I would have swapped the last scenes. I feel like in a show that's so character driven,
Mm,
I think that like the last scene of like the military people that we don't know marching through the streets isn't as effective as like the guy in the Space Needle, the guy
mm.
that we've seen so far. That's my only real note, is I think that like in terms of yeah, the show is just so good at building character and story over like the actiony set piece stuff. So that's
Yeah.
my only real note. But no, otherwise, I think I think this is an episode that has a lot going on that you can actually dive into. But I am interested to see the public reaction to it after last week's episode.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll say is going back to the beginning of the episode. Again, maybe one of the reasons why I'm manifesting we stay in Jackson a bit more is to get more of Tommy, because I think his perspective is incredibly interesting. As he'll sort of espouse later on, like, yeah, he was my brother too. Like, yes, Joel and Ellie is the center of this show, but I lost someone incredibly close to me as well. And his line, "Give Sarah my love," just like
Mm, yeah,
absolutely
that's
bowled me
brutal.
over, because you forget what he lost too. That's, obviously we follow Joel through a lot of him living through the loss of Sarah, but it was clear through, to your point, that 2003 scene that like Tommy was incredibly close with Sarah
Yeah,
as well. And so
yeah.
the fact that he is kind of the last one standing of his own family and is
Mm,
now trying to raise a bit of his own as well, that's a really incredibly emotionally fraught dynamic that I hope we get a little bit more of. And I think that was one of the things too. Obviously, we saw Ellie's reaction and we continue to do so, tearfully so, throughout the episode. But I felt like Tommy's perspective was kind of the one I was craving as well, of like, how does he react to all this? And I imagine this won't be the last time that we'll be getting his reaction and him trying to, I think, live up to maybe some of Joel's eternal expectations of how he can both continue to be a good father as well as try to keep this city safe.
Yeah, in the game, Tommy doesn't have a kid, and so adding the kid in actually feels like it's like, oh, it's an interesting, like, minor little change, but I actually think it adds a ton because there's two things. One is that there's this theme of like fatherhood
Mhm.
that connects Joel and Tommy now, and then also in the way that like Tommy can't make decisions that he might have made if he didn't have a child. So I think it's
Right.
actually a really great addition. Um, into the show. Yeah.
Minor tweak and minor leagues as well.
Mm.
Where Grace, unlike this kid's baseball team, you knocked it out of the park
Oh,
this week as
you too,
per
Mike.
usual. Tomorrow or next couple days, you'll be sitting down with Taran to
Yep.
talk through everything on the deep dive. Comparing this to the video games, and I imagine especially when it comes to looking forward as to what's coming next, there's going to be a lot of stuff to get through.
Yeah, in that podcast, people are welcome. Anybody, even if you haven't played the video game, you can join in for the first half of that podcast where we don't spoil anything. We're only ever giving context for what might be different, but we're never spoiling what's ahead. And then the back half, we do sort of look ahead. And at this point in the show, it can be very fun. The more episodes we get, the more we can be like mapping what we think we're actually getting this season versus what might end up coming next season. But Tara and I will have that podcast. I believe it mostly should drop Tuesday mornings
Okay.
is the plan for those podcasts, just to give some time. But Taryn and I also do the tastemakers, and Taryn and myself are doing Andor recaps as well. So lots going on here on RHAP
Yeah.
TV, now scripted TV.
Yeah, be sure to check it all out, because yeah, we're also in season 2 of another very well acclaimed first season show. It's some very interesting stuff to talk about with the three of us there. So if you're a Star Wars fan, check out Andor and check out our coverage, as well as all the other stuff going on We Know Scripted TV. I'm finally back to cover the 2-part season 3 finale of Battlestar Galactica with Josh on Down the Hatch. So lots of great stuff happening. Do not miss a beat of it. But that's going to do it for this week's recap of The Last of Us. I will also say a very belated thank you to Amon Adwin for subbing in for
Yes.
me. I was a very unenviable job having to come on after the episode, right after, again, one of the most brutal moments in recent television history, and try to parse through your feelings and break it all down. I admire you and Amon so much for getting to do it with such aplomb.
It's very fun. Yeah, when Amon had reached out saying, I was like, I knew he watched the show and he's played the video game, and then sort of a hole opened up in the schedule, and I was like, hey, would you like to come on to what I assume will be a big episode? And he was great, and it was so fun to get his insight into the show. Yeah.
All right. So next week, we'll see what's going on in Seattle with the WLF, and see if Dina and Ellie can indeed enact their plan to take their revenge from within. And I'm assuming plenty of other stuff to come in Jackson and perhaps elsewhere. But that's going to do it for this week's recap podcast. Thank you all so much. Let us know your thoughts, obviously, in the comments here on YouTube, on social media, as well at Hi From Grace, at a Mike Bloom type. Let us know your thoughts about this episode and what is to come. We're building our own community out here, and so we always love to hear from you all as to your thoughts about the episode and what you are going to expect is coming next, either whether you know from the games or not. So We'll be back next week covering episode 4. We'll pass the halfway point of season 2 already and see what the back half is going to provide for us in all of its splendor. Until next time, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.